So, climate change is both a short-term and a long-term problem. And so that's really what we're trying to encourage people to acknowledge is that the long-term goal is an important one, but the path to reach it is also important for two reasons, both because there are effects like floods and droughts and stronger storms and heat waves, which are already upon us. And so by lowering the rate of warming over the next couple decades, we greatly reduce the damages, make it easier to adapt to those, make it easier to meet our sustainable development goals, which are during the same period. But at the same time, some aspects of climate change really build up over a very long time. So when you think about glaciers melting and ice sheets melting, or seas rising, it's a function of how much heat they've taken up over all these decades. So the pathway that you take to a long-term target, even if you determine a target that you consider safe, or at least not as dangerous as exceeding the target, the pathway that you take to get there still plays a role in what climate damages you suffer in the long term. The key message is that we now have the agreement to limit long-term climate change, and we have sustainable development goals. And it's really trying to bring these together and recognizing, as even the Paris Climate Agreement does, that we need to encourage sustainable development at the same time we're dealing with climate change. And as the rate of warming over the next few decades mounts and becomes stronger and stronger, the damages become so great that it's hard to even meet the sustainable development goals. And so the paper is trying to recognize that although you might put off some pathways to mitigate climate change until the long term and still reach the target, if you take action near term, the real urgency is that mitigates damages for the current generation and brings you a lot of sustainable development goals. So most of the things that you want to do to mitigate climate change in the very long term are turning towards a low carbon society. And there's no question that we need to do that, and we need to do that right away. You also want to mitigate sources of emissions that cause warming that are not part of that transition to low carbon. Things like residential biofuel use, things like trash burning, things like leaking methane from poorly controlled waste management systems like landfills or oil and gas. All of those kind of things are not a key part of an early transition to low carbon society, but they're really important to reducing rates of warming in the near term. The other thing that's really important about those is they are sources of pollution that kill millions of people. So if you are to take these actions to reduce the rate of warming in the near term, you also improve people's livelihoods, their crops grow better, their children breathe better, they're not sent to the hospital with asthma attacks, they're not dying from pollution. And so meeting the sustainable development goals is far more difficult with a warming planet. It's easier with a planet that's not warming as fast, and it's much, much easier with much cleaner air. The governments of the world have committed to achieving climate change mitigation goals. They have committed to achieving sustainable development goals. But I don't think there's often an awareness of how those two are really linked. Sustainable development agenda really takes place through 2030, and many people think the climate change agenda spans the whole century. So what we really need to do by having a goal to reduce the near-term rate of warming, that helps people realize that these things are on the same time scale, and the same kind of policies push you or help you achieve both these goals. You can mitigate climate change and achieve sustainable development, benefit public health, etc. But sometimes the people working on public health are not the same as the people working on air quality, who are not the same as the people working on agriculture, or not the same as the people working on climate and energy. So if governments at the highest level would adopt a goal of reaching the long-term Paris targets by following a pathway with lowest possible rates of warming in the near term and maximum sustainable development benefits in the near term, then they could reap these joint benefits of really coordinating policies, which I think having a goal would help that come down to all the various departments and help them coordinate policies to achieve these. Anyone on their own, might not be sufficient to motivate. But if you had the realization that you were achieving benefits to multiple objectives across multiple parts of the government, then it might make it easier to get that actual job done. So reducing the rate of near-term warming will certainly help slow down the rate at which we approach tipping points and the rate at which the oceans rise and the glaciers and ice sheets melt. The only way we can really avoid crossing thresholds which lead to tipping points that we can't define these thresholds that well. We don't know exactly where they are, but the only way we can avoid crossing them is if we also control CO2. And so if we manage to get on the kind of path that we pledged to be on in the Paris Agreement, which is going towards a 2-degree world and not something like a 4 or 5-degree world, then the combination of reducing short-lived climate pollutants and CO2 means we don't peak at as high a level before we get there. And so that really could protect us from things like massive carbon release from permafrost, or being above the melting point of, say, West Antarctica for long enough for all that huge mass of water to slip into the ocean. So these could have important, extremely important long-term consequences. I think it's very important to keep those in mind, but it's very difficult to know exactly what these thresholds are. If we think of this as a problem of risk, and something like, is your house going to catch on fire? Well, probably not, but you buy insurance anyway, right? So this is maybe not something that's going to happen in the next 20 years if we don't do this, but there's a risk. There's a significant risk, a massive rise of the ice sheet, a massive rise of the oceans as the ice sheets melt. And anything we can do to lower that risk, I think, should be treated as very valuable.